Thank you. Now being joined to your conference.
Mute their lines. They're using your phone or using *6. I think we can start with. We'll kick it off with Darity from Duke University.
Okay, John. With support forward, and we're grateful to A. Brown as our program officer. The Samuel Du Bois Cook Center at Duke and along with the New School jointly have developed a project that's called the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color. This is a project that examines disparity and asset disparity in the United States. There are three dimensions to the project. The first is the collection of national data, making use of some existing data sets or the analysis of national data. In particular, we use the panel study on income dynamics and the survey of income and program participation, and we generated a couple of reports from that database. The second and the most innovative dimension of the project is a series of phone interviews that have been conducted in American cities. Cities were selected to facilitate our capacity to identify specific ethnic and racial groups at a more precise or detailed national origin level, so that instead of just considering Hispanics collectively, we can look specifically at the worth positions of individuals who are Dominican or Cuban or Puerto Rican or and so we selected the particular cities to enable us to do that. The four initial cities in the study are Tulsa, Oklahoma, Miami, Florida, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, California. And with some complementary support from the Federal Reserve of Boston, we were able to add Boston and have some hopes that the Richmond Federal Reserve will support an effort to do a similar phone survey in Baltimore, Maryland. The third dimension to our project is a series of face-to-face interviews that we are conducting in Los Angeles. The face-to-face interviews permit us to actually gather information about the phenotype of individuals so that we can determine whether or not there's a relationship to individual appearance, especially skin shade, and their wealth and employment histories. And what will be particularly unique about this database is that it is perhaps the first to actually have attached to it photographs of the respondents. I think about half of the respondents have agreed to have their photographs taken. The last thing I want to do in these opening remarks is suggest that there are two major frames that have been used to explain or understand racial and ethnic inequality in the United States. One frame emphasizes the notion that the group that is at the bottom or the group that's in the inferior position has certain kinds of dysfunctional behaviors or characteristics. And so in some sense, it's the actions of the group members themselves that lead to the kinds of inequalities that we observe. A second kind of frame says that the qualities that we observe are attributable to historical factors, structural factors, ongoing discrimination, and the like. We are very, very much attached to the second frame as being the more powerful and relevant explanatory basis for understanding inequalities. At the Cook Center, we have 5 areas of focus: employment, education, health, wealth, and identity. And I would like to provide some illustrations about the superiority of the second frame, the historical structural discriminatory frame, for examining employment differences by race. So, for example, at every level of education, the black unemployment rate in the United States is 2 times the white unemployment rate. And for whites who have not completed high school, whites who have not completed high school actually have a lower unemployment rate than blacks who have completed some college. Another important evidence is from Diva Pager's studies, where she has conducted field experiments in New York City and in Milwaukee, where she has discovered that whites with criminal records have a higher likelihood of being called back for interviews for jobs than blacks who do not have a criminal record. So this is suggestive that the historical and structural factors are far more important in explaining differences in employment than claims about certain kinds of cultural deficiencies that might be possessed by blacks. So correspondingly, I think that the research on wealth reinforces the kind of perspective we have, and Darrick is going to talk about that in some detail, the findings that we've generated from the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color.
All right, so I guess I'll take it from here. If we go to the first slide, please. Basic. All right, thank you. So I'm probably going to go through this quickly because I think the slides can be made available. I want to make sure Tom has adequate time, and then we have a lot of time for Q&A. So let's start with some framing the importance of wealth. This is a lot of what Sandy says, and it also allows us to look at a dimension of inequality wealth, which I think will really address the notion of are inequalities structural or behaviorally related, especially since the primary source of wealth in the empirical speech become intergenerational transfers, which are more structural rather than behavioral. They're related to familial position in which one is born. There's also an important indicator to examine because of its, go back, please, because of economic opportunity, security, overall well-being. And it's an indicator in which communities of colors are most disparate. And then the last point I want to make is that thinks about economic development. I think wealth provides with a more concept of human capabilities, the ability to have agency over one's life, to be able to make choice as it relates to own well-being. Wealth probably the indicator to give people the greatest human capability aside from their health. Obviously, if they're in poor health, that limits their human capabilities. But aside from health, wealth gives one the most agency if they want to have development in whatever human endeavor they want to pursue. Next slide, please. And many are probably familiar with the disparity that exists based on wealth. And in post the recession, the disparities have even enlarged. If we look at 2005, the typical household had about 9 cents for every dollar. The typical white household, it would be 14 cents for Latino households. Asians had slightly more wealth at about nearly 25 cents more per dollar in compared to the typical white household. If we fast forward to the recession and then post-recession towards the expansion period of 2011, you see that the typical Black and Latino household now has 6 and 7 cents respectively for every dollar in wealth held by the typical household. The absolute wealth gap exceeds $100,000. If we look at Asians started out in a position where they had 25% wealth in the typical white household. After that, and in the aftermath, now they have less wealth, and they suffered the largest absolute loss in their wealth position. They lost $84,000 in their wealth position from when the recession began to 2011, and this is using SIP data. And what we know is that a large part of the Asian story is related to geographical position. They benefited from the housing boom because of where they live. They live in areas that had the largest rise in housing prices, and likewise, they suffered the most from the housing bust. So geography had a lot to do with the Asian story. So if we move on to the next slide, and assets, so if we don't talk about home ownership, but rather talk about assets that can be readily converted into cash, we can see the gaps are tremendous and indicate that Blacks and Latinos pretty much have little assets to deal with any number of financial emergencies that might arise. The typical Black and Latino households have about $200 and $340 respectively liquid assets in comparison to $23,000 for white households, and exclude retirement savings. The typical household has about $25 in liquid assets. Okay, please move to the next slide. So what do we know from national data and why is NAS necessary? the lessons learned from national data that's in existence is that Black Latinos have little liquid assets to deal with any number of financial emergency or to take risks in there so that they can their assets. Communities of color suffered the most, and then, as I mentioned, Asians suffered the largest absolute loss. So we move on. If we move to the next slide, you can see that the narrative is incomplete. The markets are local. That's indicative of the Asian story. We know that where they live had a lot to do with their positioning. So rather than look at the national picture of how groups are doing, it would be useful to look on a local context and compare it into group inequality. The housing crisis is indicative of the need to look locally. Also, thinking of broad categories of Asian and Latino and even Blacks, and perhaps even whites is problematic. What we really need to look at is heterogeneity within the group. The experience of an Asian person with Japanese heritage, for example, probably a lot different than one who might have migrated to the country, more likely in refugee status as, say, a Cambodian or Vietnamese. And then also, if we think about indigenous groups, they're often included all together or put into the amorphous category of other, in case we have notation about their economic well-being or position. Next slide, please. So, and Kilolo had a lot to do with this. Kilolo, who was original program officer, and the generous support of her and Amy Brown has allowed us to do work. We assembled a multidisciplinary and ethnically diverse team to deal with this question, and we're tasked with trying to get data of groups based on their specific ancestry. And we looked locally because we wanted to provide implicit thinking locally. We're dealing with common products and prices of assets and debt products, so we can have some implicit control for those features by looking within local groups. And then we strategically chose cities that allowed us to get at some heterogeneity, and Sandy mentioned those cities. There are lots of people on our team that contributed to this work, many probably on this call. Truly, in my opinion, is an ongoing team effort. Limitations of this project was statistical power. We didn't have unlimited sources of resources, so for some groups we don't have large numbers of observations, so that limits our ability to find statistical significance when in fact statistical significance is there. But when we do find statistical significance, I think that makes the results even that much more powerful. Also, external validity. We didn't cover all cities, we covered select cities. For example, when we look at Native Americans in Tulsa, Native might live in a city where they're not plentiful as Tulsa, Oklahoma, like say Los Angeles or New York, or live in a rural community. We have no ability to describe their financial position. And only look at private assets. So if people are considerate of things like where you have assets associated with your group because of location or something like that, we're somewhat limited in looking at public assets. All right, slide, please. So I'm going to present a little bit of results. The project allowed us to get at unconventional assets and debts, things like payday lending, whether individuals use debt capturing institutions, et cetera. So I'm just going to present some evidence from payday lending, for example. Now, these are loans that are very predatory because they have exorbitant interest rates. The Score Responsible Lending is doing a great deal of work on this, demonstrating that real variations in regulations have large impacts on usage. I think NAS data can contribute to this as well. We have localities like Los Angeles, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Miami have less of a regulatory environment on payday lending than places like Massachusetts, which would include Boston or Washington, D.C. And if we're to look at this chart, they can see that the usage in Boston and Washington, D.C. is much less than the other cities in terms of how you or anyone in your family used the payday lending product in the last 5 years. Oklahoma is one of our highest used cities, and we find that even the white group had high usage in Tulsa, Oklahoma. About 9% of the families in Nash and in Tulsa, Oklahoma report the use of a payday lending in the last 5 years. And about a third of individuals that were tribally enrolled as a Creek Native American use payday lending product. Okay. Next, in terms of median household wealth, again, I can say a lot of our evidence was somewhat consistent with what's found in national data. I'll point out a little bit of different in this slide. Again, in the interest of moving on, a city in Boston, we the highest. Boston, it was indicative of some of the highest levels of inequality when we compared white group to some of the other populations. In LA, we could see that some of the Asian groups actually had more wealth than some of the white groups, although we weren't able to detect statistically significant values compared to the white group. But we were able to find considerable heterogeneity within the Asian group. So, for example, the wealth position of Koreans was significantly less than the white group, whereas some of the, like Japanese and Chinese, was not so. Vietnamese tended to have lower wealth in the LA context as well. Something to point out, if we compare ethnic groups across cities, we can see that the wealth position of Koreans residing in LA was very different than that of their position in Washington, D.C. Korean wealth position in LA, the median wealth was about $23,400. In comparison, if a Korean residing in Washington, D.C., your median wealth position was about $496,000. Something else that's noteworthy to point out, political affiliations seem to matter very much. If we take a city like Tulsa, Oklahoma, we can see the individuals that were enrolled in a tribal group. If you were Native American and tribally enrolled, your wealth position tended to be higher than that if you were not tribally enrolled. And it's so important to point out that the Cherokee group in Oklahoma to occupy a higher wealth position than the other Native groups. And last, I'll just report that across the board, if U.S. descendant Black or Mexican descendant, you used to have low levels of wealth regardless of which city you resided in. So I'll just summarize some findings from NASC. If we move to the next slide, please. Some broad findings is that variation with defined ethnic categories existed, suggesting the need to go beyond these homogeneous categories like Latino and Asian when looking at positions. Second, this is probably not a surprise, income inequality paled in comparison to wealth inequality. So not enough just to use the census data, which allows us to get a specifically defined group because of the large number of observations. If we want to understand individual heterogeneity as America becomes more plural with more and more group variation, it's important to capture wealth information. Ethnic groups' relative asset position, not only within city but across city, for a specific ethnic group. Didn't present any of the information in this presentation, but some evidence to suggest that home ownership might not be the only driver of wealth equality. For example, Asian Indians were a group that reported relatively low levels of home ownership in a place like Los Angeles, but yet they had high levels of wealth. So they were indicative of a group that was able to acquire relatively high levels of wealth, but it wasn't necessarily through home ownership. And as I mentioned before, substantial asset variation across and within, with Black Mexicans consistently at the bottom. So let me move on and talk about this in terms of context. So despite these variations, next slide, please. The in America is that we're post-racial, we transcended the racial divide. The problem with that narrative is that it removes social responsibility for the conditions of subaltern groups. If it's literally the liberal context of individual agency with regards to where they end up in life, then the problem is addressing people's behavior, not their structural environment. And I think we have a lot of evidence to suggest that the narrative is not right. And, the narrative becomes that if you hard, graduate from college, and get a good job, well, you can secure an economic position in life that's or happy or economically secure. If you look at wealth, next slide, I'm going to do a series of 3 slides that shows that just looking at black-white comparisons, we have black groups that have seemingly worked hard, studied hard, and achieved a relatively high level of income. But if we look at wealth as as their outcome, which is really determined with regard to human capabilities as we described earlier, not secured a secure economic position. For example, if you look at this slide, you can see that if you were in the middle income distribution in black, between the household income of $35,000 and about $57,000, your median net worth of $13,800, less than that if you were in a white family in the lowest quintile income, where white families earning below $18,000 had a median wealth position of about $15,000. Next slide, please. Employment, we can see that head of households, if you are in a family where the head of household was black and unemployed, your median wealth position was about $11,649, which is lower than that for if you were in a white family and the head of household was unemployed. The median wealth was nearly $10,000 higher at $20,892. Indeed, if you were black and unemployed, your median wealth position was $0. So that very assets or no assets if you deal with your economic poor position. Next, please. Studying hard, we can see that if your household that was black and the head household had a college degree, your wealth of $23,400 was about $10,000 less, or only 2/3 of that if you were in a white household and dropped out of high school, where the median wealth was $34,700. So studying hard doesn't address or solve the interracial wealth gap. Okay. So to put this context, in the interest of time, I'm going to summary and just talk about a policy that Sandy and I have been talking about for quite a while, where we think could address the racial wealth gap. The source of any in our society is if you're an adult, some people have access to capital or some resources through intergenerational transfer or some mechanisms that put into an asset that can create an automatic function of savings, like a house, for example, where you're paying down a mortgage, but also will appreciate over their lifetime and provide economic security. While young adults have access to this seed capital, and hence are in a position where they're never able to secure economic security through some appreciating asset. So baby bonds, which are child trust accounts, are intended to address source of inequality by providing every American with some initial capital to purchase an asset that will appreciate over their lifetime. Now, these baby bonds would be seeded gradationally based on the familial position in which individuals are born. In terms of could we afford it, the full cost of baby bonds, the way we envision, will up to about 2% of current federal expenditures, and that would be a relatively low cost in terms of policy that could really allow us to live up to the American credo that allows everybody access, so the fruit of their activities, labor, and educational effort to translate into economic security. So move on and just finally offer some thanks. Next slide. As truly a collaborative effort, so many organizations to thank, as well as many individuals that are included probably in this phone call and not in this phone call, but we hope to continue this project so that we can address these narratives with some strong evidence that can talk about what we can do, lead to an American society that breaks the cruel links of intergenerational immobility. Thank you. you.
Thank you much, Darrick and Sandy. It was a really great presentation. I encourage the listeners to write questions in the chat bar in the webinar screen. And when we do the question and answer, I'll ask the presenters questions. So moving on to Tom Shapiro now from Brandeis. Take it away.
Thank you very much, John and Darrick and Sandy. As usual, that was amazing and has left us with a whole lot to think about. I want to pick up as a transition with this notion and talking about narrative a little bit. Now, the Ford Foundation should receive an incredible amount of recognition for putting into play a number of researchers and institutes. You've heard of some today already. Urban's on the call. There are one or two others. I direct the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at the Heller School at Brandeis University, and we are among the small group that for a number of years now has been doing some very rigorous research on race and wealth in the United States. And I think it's really amazing to think about the following fact, if you will. When I and most of us talk the racial wealth gap, the numbers are never consistent. And how well the work we've done, and how we intersect with each other, and how we keep updating it, and showing very, very similar patterns. What is contested is the meaning. When inequality exists, what the drivers of the racial wealth gap really are. And Darrick greatly started, and he started to take those up in terms of looking at the social and the relatively small behavioral and characteristic framing of it. The Institute on Assets and Social Policy, I just quickly highlight 5 areas that we are involved in terms of the racial wealth gap in the United States. Along with others, do continuous work trying to figure out what the baseline is. What is the racial wealth gap today in the United States? And there's data sources that we work with. We've mentioned the panel study in income dynamics, the survey of income and program participation. Some of us also work with the survey on consumer finances, the Federal Reserve Board puts up. And the numbers on these might differ a little bit, but what's amazing is the pattern stays very, very similar. So the data that Darrick showed earlier from SIP basically tells us African Americans own 6 cents for every dollar of wealth that typical white families have, and maybe 6.5 or 7 cents for Latino families. The kind of pattern hasn't changed a whole lot over the years, and that's the kind of pattern that doesn't change when we look at it from different databases. All is to say that we're really on to something here as researchers and as an initiative in getting that data and that information out. As an Assets and Social Policy, we also have taken up the question of what happened to the racial wealth gap over time. A lot of work, for example, looking at following families since the panel study of dynamics started asking families about their financial assets and liabilities in 1984 to some of the more recent studies. And these are the same set of families. So it's not if you're comparing cross-sectional panels at different points in time, but the capacity of looking at the same set of families and asking the question over 25, 27, 29 years, what's happened to the racial wealth gap with that set of families? We looked at this data and we issued what I hope was some very significant, I know the report's got a lot of traction about a year ago, racial wealth gap over 27 years has tripled. And this back to some of Darrick's comments around false notion we're living in a post-racial society. 1960s, some really hard-won civil rights legislation around education, around housing, around communities, and around work. Yet, even though opportunity might have gotten better, and perhaps that's problematic, when we look at wealth has not. That set of families that go to American schools, American jobs, American policies, that racial wealth gap over a generation has tripled. At ASP, we also try to do some work that asks the question, what's driving? Why is that racial wealth gap increasing over a period of time? And for example, we do look at things like the home mortgage interest deduction. We do look at work. We do return from employment, what people are paid. We do look at education. And look at marital status. We do look at some of those called behavioral notions. And the analysis that we come up with, totally in line with what Darrick was talking about, really highlights and underscores the structural factors. I could just, for example, pick up on one other report that CFED put every other year or so, the home mortgage interest deduction. Housing subsidies in the United States, we subsidize home ownership to the tune of about $200 billion a year. Subsidize housing in various forms for low-income families in comparison, only $35 billion a year. Now, if $200 billion a year for home ownership were somewhat democratically dispersed and available and deep into the American population, we could think about it one way. But the FED data and others tell us that 72% of the tax benefits of that $200 billion go to the wealthiest groups in the United States because their homes are larger, that is, their mortgages are larger, and tax brackets are higher. Therefore, it's a highly regressive way in which wealth is being, in fact, redistributed toward those that need it the least, that is, those at the very top. We also work on what to me is a very exciting, relatively new project. It's really not new. We've been working on it for a while, but the results are just beginning to hit. We developed a tool called the Racial Wealth Audit, in partnership with DOS in New York City and some others across the country. Essentially, we were trying to ask and answer the question, what would a policy proposal, what would distributional impact be for the racial wealth gap? So, for example, I know all too well, we're coming up on the state presidential election cycle season, where we now have about 25 or more candidates, at least, and that's probably going to grow by the day. All kinds of notions and proposals, many of which say something about student debt. What the Racial Wealth Audit does is to look at those proposals for those that dare enough to put in the details, which are very, very few. Ask the question, their proposal actually close the racial wealth gap, make it worse, or stay the same? For example, we've worked very closely with DEMOS on a student debt proposal, and what we have found, for example, is that those eligible up to about twice the poverty level and reducing about half of the student debt is the sweet spot in the proposal that actually reduces student debt the most, while at the same time make a significant reduction in the wealth gap in the United States. That project, with the analysis we do, has also some very interesting and deep learning for us, and I want to just relay one of those learnings as a provocation, if you will, to some of the work that we do, that we all do, and that we do in the future. What the Racial Wealth Audit has revealed is when we only look at means of access, that is opportunity, the classic liberal notion that everybody should get into college, that everybody should have a fair job, that everybody should have access to a community, the typical thought legislation that was one that really focused on lack of opportunity and access. That's important. Even more important in closing the racial wealth gap is, if the economists on the call will allow me to use this term, it's return. And just showed some data, for example, that very poignantly reminds us that a college education, that is where the access and achievement actually equal, returns wealth very differently for white families than it does for families of color, and indicates that the continuity of very deeply embedded racialized structures in the United States around education, around home ownership, around work, and the other institutional areas as well. And finally, I would like to highlight one other aspect of the work that the Institute on Assets and Social Policy does. We've been very fortunate from the Ford Foundation to interview a set of families that were first interviewed in 1998 and follow them up and re-interview them in 2010 and 2011. These are relatively young families with school-age children in 3 cities in the United States. And one of the direct outcomes from this qualitative data, very in-depth family interviews, is a series of policy briefs that we call Leveraging Mobility. And our website and others, you can see Leveraging Mobility policy reports have come out around work, around environment, around being neighborhoods, and what we call the web of wealth, or how funds flow within kinship and social networks. And we think in early October, I think that's going to be the date, we'll keep our fingers crossed. This report in the series is going to be on women and wealth. And also coming out of that data set is a book by Tom Shapiro with the title of Toxic Inequality, that if I get off of this call and keep writing, the publisher will be happy and the rest of the world might see it in the spring of 2016. So I think that's a lot for us to chew on, and let me go back to John and open it up for questions.
All right. We'll keep it pretty till 3:15 so you can get back to writing for sure. That'll be a great book, I'm sure. So we have some questions. The first one is for Darrick. A listener was curious to know what amount of money is considered a transfer, what the dollar cutoff that includes small amounts given every month, or only as a larger sum. So in the context of wealth transfers and intergenerational inequality.
I think this is asked in the frame of baby bonds and what we might envision with regards to a baby bond transfer.
Yeah, in vivo transfers and.
I answered in terms of baby bonds. I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about is enough of a transfer to give people access to purchase that that's going to pay over their lifetime. So we're really talking about allowing people to have a down payment to purchase a house, for example, or allowing people to graduate from college relatively debt-free, or allowing people to have access to a down payment, collateralized a loan to start a new business. So with something like baby bonds, we envision if you're born into the most wealth-poor family, be endowed with an account worth upwards to $50,000 or $60,000. The average household would get a baby bond of about $20,000, and to get universality similar to Social Security, we would, if you're born into one of the more wealthy households, get a nominal account of maybe $500, for example. I guess to answer somewhat briefly, we're talking about the average American getting an account at birth of about $20,000, which will grow at a federal guaranteed interest rate of about 1.5% to 2%. But the accounts, again, would be gradationally funded so that if your family is not as well off, you still would have access to this seed money that other Americans would have.
Okay, very much. So I got a clarification on the context of the question, and it wasn't really about, he wasn't asking it in the question of baby bonds per se. but the wealth that exists currently. So what did you find out about transfers in your research on past drivers of wealth?
Got it. Well, we're working with Yanju Nam as well as we're working Dan Price. We have a report that's going to come out relatively soon. I don't know the exact dollar amount off the top of my head, but one of the things that the report does is it looks at transfers to adult children, so not looking at transfers that people might have accumulated over their lifetime. You have an adult child and you receive a transfer, and you provide a transfer for activities. One is education, the other is home ownership, and the other is a more big category of everything else. And we can look at that transfer and who receives the transfer, how many people give that transfer, and even dollar amounts of that transfer, and also how it might translate into whether you are a home ownership owner or whether you do graduate from college. Off the top of my head, I don't know the dollar amount that we have, but very soon that report will come out with that information. The sources of the information really would be the Institute just recently put out a paper. Signy is one of the lead authors. I know that there are other people on that as well, including Mark Sims. I can't remember the other co-authors. They list the dollar values based on PID, which indicate information about how much transfers people might give from one generation to the next.
I'd like to pitch this back to Tom because he has talked at length, and I think this is one of the issues he's going to take up in his new book, about in which the tax and transfer system is regressive in and of itself, and has really pronounced effects on perpetuating wealth inequality.
Sure. Thank you, Sandy. Let me I can add some specificity to the inheritance question. First of all, we do need to talk about inheritance as not just resources that are passed when a relative passes away, but what happens over the course of the lifetime. We call those in vivo transfers and goes up. Darrick was absolutely right. Urban has a great report that looks at the transfers over a 2-year period and really nets it out. It looks at families that receive them, families that get them, what that looks like. We've also done some work over a long period of time using PSID data, looking over the 27 years, and told me to the dollar figure right down to the penny. I think I'm going to be pretty close here. Or a long period of time in the same set of families. Over a third of whites have inherited over that period of time a substantial amount of money. Those little over a third of whites that have inherited, the median amount they have inherited is $83,000. But and think back to the data that Darrick and I gave about what baseline is. So for white wealth, it's $112,000. All right, a third of those families, if you can translate the data, received an inheritance over a period of time about $83,000. Less than 1 in 10 African American families also received an inheritance over the same period of time. All right, to start with, it's more than a 4.5 times ratio about who inherits and who doesn't. But in that when African Americans do inherit, they inherit, the median amount is about $30,000 less. Now, the urban study calculation, the inheritance accounts for about 12% of the racial wealth gap. A pretty good number to think about. I think it might be bigger if we deal with longer periods of time, but I think the main point here is that gets us very quickly to a legacy of race in the United States. Because after all, wealth is created in situations that was made available to some.
Yeah, just to jump in quick to put context on that 12% number, 12% of about less than 50% of what they can explain. So it's 12, it's in the context of being able to explain a total of 50%, 12% can be explained. And as Tom mentioned earlier, it's also over a 2-year period, not over a longer horizon in their study.
All right, Tom, there's another question for you. Are there other policies that you'll be analyzing using the racial wealth audit?
Yes. Yes. So we are looking, and prospectively we'll look at what a rise in the minimum wage to, say, for example, $15 would do. There are policies around the earned income tax credit, strengthening those, and policies around strengthening the social security system that we plan to look at as well. The tougher ones for us to look at are the ones from the tax code, just because the data is a little tougher to get at. We've not actually looked at Darrick and Sandy's baby bond proposals. It is it's children's savings accounts on steroids, if you will. That's far more robust than the programs in existence in the United States now. And we are looking at children's savings accounts and being able to put that through the tool as well.
So Sandy and Darrick, there's another question for you about the framing of your research. So as Darrick mentioned, it seems like a major barrier to enacting some of these policies that will start to unravel the racial undertones of the wealth gap. It's the word, and you'll be able to succeed. So are you guys working with any messaging or groups or projects that are taking on the framing of your research?
Definitely. We're working in particular with another center that actually, I believe, received support from Ford, Insight CSED, and specifically we're working with Ann Price, who heads the Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative, on ways in which we can best frame and present our ideas so that hopefully people will actually listen.
Yeah. And I'd just add, the most parsimonious and direct way to address the racial wealth gap would be race-targeted policies. But for you people who said, politically that won't happen, neither Stanley or I have abandoned race-specific policies, but we sat on as a constraint and come up with something that would provide access to all Americans, which would be baby bonds.
So in the context of the tribal data, the American tribes that was presented on briefly, as the research continues, will you be examining the wealth differences in Western versus Eastern tribes? So, like Tulsa, for example, tends to have more Eastern tribal representation, whereas Oklahoma City more Western tribal representation. Was there anything that's in the research?
So it's really contingent on whether or not we have resources to continue to extend or expand the application of our survey instrument. That's the big constraint, is that the conduct of these surveys is relatively expensive, and we're very lucky that Ford has made the commitment to the initiative that it has thus far, but it's quite costly to extend it. We're trying to work or collaborate with some branches of the Federal Reserve to examine communities that are within their respective district purviews. But that's the key answer to the question is, we'd love to be able to get more information about a wider range of communities, to be able to compare, say, the eastern band of the Cherokee with the Cherokee communities in the western part of the United States. But we can only do that if we have the resources to conduct additional surveys.
And if you get a picture, we are trying to use specific methods to examine intergroup inequality, and we really think that using this variation across region and compare intergroup inequality within to some evidence towards that bigger picture. So as Andy said, our goal would be to expand, but we hope we go outside of the U.S. context. But looking at intergroup inequality in Britain, for example, India. So we're really trying to extend this to really build up this science. And we know that there are other partners that are doing similar activities and trying to gather the evidence so we can build up some good understanding of intergroup inequality theoretically and empirically.
So there are no more questions. If anyone has any last-minute questions, please put them in the chat. But Sandy, Darrick, if you guys have anything else you'd like to say, please say it.
Sure. So let me lead it off. I want to double down on the thanks to a lot of people whose shoulders all of our work stand on. The least of which Kalolo's incredible leadership, Frank, and now Amy at the Ford Foundation and others. But to everybody on this call, as I'm looking and scrolling through who's on call, I think we know each other. We've been at meetings with each other's work. We help to become megaphones for each other, and I think that's really important because. By myself, Sandy by himself, Darrick by himself, the professor in a very small, and with everybody involved in this incredible initiative, we talk to a world.
I'll go, Darrick, and I'll be last since I was first.
I mean, I'm going to be really brief and just say that I think that this is the moment to really address inequality. It seems like things are lining up in the world, and that a key mention is not only just looking at inequality broadly speaking, but looking at intergroup inequality in particular.
So I'd like to say that that the phenomenon of wealth inequality requires far more dramatic interventions than the types that have typically been considered. And I think we have to confront the fact that the policies have to have a redistributive dimension. The key thing that I think is informing the kind of policies that Darrick and I are trying to design, and we're not exclusively wedded to the baby bonds proposal, is the development of policies that involve redistribution without confiscation. I mean, that's the key phrase I want to use, redistribution without confiscation. And the more creative we can become in designing policies that will have the effect of really changing the wealth distribution, not just in the United States, but in other countries across the world, the better the world is that we will probably have.
Thank you very much to everyone who called in, and very, very special thanks to the presenters. Really, really great information. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. We want to thank you, too, for organizing all of this.
Yeah, John, thank you for all the logistical support here.
Oh, of course. Thank you all for cooperating so much. So thank you very much. I'll be sending out the recording of the presentation and the slides by the end of the day. If you have any more questions about presentation, please let me know, and I'll try to I'll send them along to the presenters. So everyone, again, have a great day.
Wonderful.